WHIVFM.org. We're honoring independent voices at 102.3 FM, WHIV-LP, New Orleans.
Good morning, comrades. You are listening to WHIV-LP New Orleans 102.3. This is your weekly Good Morning Comrade. That's right, folks. Got Jeff in the studio. Robert, conspicuous by his absence, I've been back for 1 week, and I've already taken back over the show. Unbelievable. Actually, he's on jury duty today. He can't make it out. And Aaron's actually out of town, so we actually have a special guest today. We have Raul. What's going on, Raul?
Not much, Jeff. How you doing, man?
Good. Speak directly into that microphone. Bring it a little bit closer. There you go. Yep. There you go. Nope. Hey, you got it. Good technique.
All right.
So, and today we're going to actually talk a little bit about we're going to talk about wide-ranging conversation, things that involve immigration policy and also the experience of immigration, because Raul is actually from Peru, and we can actually even talk about the instability there as well if you're interested. But
yeah, sure.
I guess if you want to really briefly introduce yourself, go right ahead.
So I'm Raul Vadaurre. I am a documentarian. Been making docs since 2007, and now I work in communications for one of the largest property services unions in the labor movement. So very excited.
Yeah, we're glad to have you on the show, and so just to kind of like kick it off, you wanted to talk about some specific things about immigration. If you want to just sort of take it away in terms of like what your background is and your experiences with it, and we can kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts as we go.
All right, cool. So I mean, when we were thinking about what we would discuss, I think to me it's I was born in Peru. I lived in Venezuela for a few years, and then actually moved to the States in '87. I was 7 years old at the time. So I migrated initially as a kid with my parents. My parents, brought me over. My dad had a family or whatever. And I had this experience of migrating as a child without really realizing, everything that went on behind the scenes, so to speak. Mm-hmm. In 2009, I moved to Peru with my ex-wife and lived there for about 10 years and came back late 2018. Now myself as head of household with my new wife and daughter, and there's the experience was completely different, right? It was it was two completely different migration experiences. One from being a child and not understanding everything that was going on, and also the process as a new immigrant, a new migrant. We came with. My dad came and did some kind of a business visa, and my mother at the time had she couldn't work, I think, because she had like a visa that was like she was accompanying the business person, so she wasn't. This weird like gray area.
There's a lot of really like restrictive labor rules specifically when it comes to status.
Right, exactly. And then we came in as students. And had we stayed that way, once we came of age, once we turned 18, we probably, or we stopped studying, we would have lost our status completely, right?
So basically, you have to go to school, or you're out of the country, or you're here like technically illegally, and you can essentially be, collected by Border Patrol and sent packing.
Right, and I know people that have had those situations, that have been in those situations, right? I know people that growing up, once they turned 18 or they realized they had to go to college, for example, that's when they actually realized that, hey, they didn't really have status, but they grew up here.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so like they couldn't go to college, or they had to pay as foreigners, or it's insane, right?
That's a lot of those kids that were benefiting from DACA as well, right? The deferred action, which is something we can get into a little bit later.
Right, but deferred action came much after. I mean, I was born in 1980, right? So like I'm talking
DACA wasn't until the 2000s,
right?
Like until Obama administration.
Exactly. So people that came up or I grew up with, in '98, lost their status. And
Yeah.
it's how do they move forward, right? And so I know people that moved back to Latin America because of that. I also know people that just simply couldn't study or had to remain illegally for a while, and it's terrible, right? And so
Hard to get a job.
Of course. And so that was just growing up. I never realized everything that went into that, right? Thankfully, I eventually became a U.S. citizen, and when I went back to Peru and decided to come back as a U.S. citizen, it really, bringing my wife and daughter over, they didn't have papers here, right? So going through the immigration process now, coming back, migrating. I mean, people, there's something to be said about why people migrate too, right? Like if you really go back to the reasons why I migrated personally, right? In 1987 in Peru, from 1980 to 2000 in Peru, we had what they call the internal armed conflict, right? So it was the Peruvian government was battling basically terrorist groups that were Marxist groups, in theory they were Marxist groups.
Sure.
And there was a lot of terrorism. And so none of that really came into the capital, into Lima, into the capital of Peru, until the late 80s. But it started mid to late 70s while we had a military dictatorship in Peru, right?
Which is its own political situation.
Let's not even get into that, right? So, but in 87, one of the first bombs that actually blew up in Lima blew up next to my house.
Yeah.
Right? Like there was a car bomb that blew up next to my house. There was a bank next to the building that we lived in. And inside the bank, there was a government office. And that's what they were targeting. It wasn't a huge bomb, but it was an explosion, right?
It's big enough to scare the pants off of you.
So when that happened, my dad said, okay, this hit way too close to home, literally. And so he decided to pack up and leave. And so we came to the States because of that. And I never realized the severity of that, right? And there's something to be said about also like what that does to your mind state, right? In 1992 in Miami, Hurricane Andrew passed through, right? And the military was actually present in Miami. And I remember, being a 12-year-old kid and my classmates would always be surprised or would be in shock or would be, I don't know, it was kind of exciting maybe to see military personnel on the streets with machine guns, basically, right?
That's why they do it. That's why they do that.
But they're like, oh, they have machine guns, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, and some of them were like, oh, this is weird, this is crazy. And some of them were like, oh, this is really cool, right?
But like those kind of parades are a demonstration of like we have military superiority. We got everything under control. Don't worry, citizen. Like that kind of thing, right? It's a form of propaganda, really.
I mean, it is. I think, but to the point is, I remember some kids thinking like it was just both of those things, right? It was like it was really cool, or like this is kind of scary that there's machine guns like next to our school,
right?
But to me, that was normal because growing up in Peru, there were machine guns.
Yeah.
Like you walk into a bank, there was a guy with a machine gun. You walked into, a supermarket even, there was a guy with a machine gun. Like that's what security guys had, machine guns. You know what I mean? Like that was normal for me. So, anyway, so to think about why people migrate, like from that, if you look at it from that from my personal perspective, we migrated literally because there was a war going on in my country. Yeah. A bomb blew up next to my house, and it was either you stay and you live through that, or you get the hell out of Dodge, right? And so having the opportunity, that's what my father decided to do. And I'm grateful. I'm grateful that he did because I know a lot of people that did grow up in the late 80s and 90s in Peru. And, it wasn't easy. I mean, my dad's birthday was actually on the anniversary of the Shining Path. And the Shining Path was one of the terrorist groups. Mm-hmm. And every year for their anniversary, they would actually blow up the electrical towers. Right? Oh. We lived on the 12th story of a building. Okay, so I remember countless days where my father would actually have to walk up 12 stories carrying stuff on his birthday, walk back down 12 stories, pick up my sister who was a year younger, and carry her up 12 stories. Thankfully, he was in good shape, right?
Right. Well, I'll get you in good shape, won't it?
This is not normal. Like this isn't what people should be living through, right? And this happens all over the world, unfortunately. And it is a lot of people migrate because they're in these situations. Mm-hmm. You see it in Central America, you see it in South America. You're seeing it now in Ukraine, right? Like these things happen. So,
If there's a war happening here, I don't want to stay here.
Right, exactly.
And I have the ability to leave, so I will. Unfortunately, not everybody has that opportunity, or people will have to escape through different means, through less legal means, even.
Right, exactly. And there's something that I never realized the severity of that, of what that meant to have a bomb blow up next to your house until I moved back to Peru. And when I moved back to Peru, I worked on a project. So I've done a lot of documentary work, but a lot of production work as well. And there's a museum in downtown, not downtown Lima, but anyway, one of the districts in Lima that's called Lugar de la Memoria, right? So it's the place for memory, basically. And what it does is it tells the story of what's again called the internal armed conflict that was established to be between 1980 and 2000, right? That's the time frame that they've established. So it's a museum that tells the story of what happened in that time. It was over 60,000 people that died during that time period, right? And it wasn't. What's really interesting about that museum is that everything that happened is actually pretty well told. Like the story is really well told because it tells you what the terrorists did, but it also tells you the damage that the government did.
The whole story. Not just, like it. I mean, I'm not sure who is the founders and the funders of these this thing, but the idea that they're attempting to at least the way you're describing it to tell the story as completely as possible is like that's the. I mean, well, that's an important thing because you're not just saying like there's a reason that there's terrorists, there's a reason that there's unrest, and it's not to make excuses for for what they're doing, but the part of the reason is because these governments a lot of times will be. You said it was a military dictatorship. I mean, there have to be, when you have a military dictatorship, that military is going to be used for something.
Yeah, and not only that, the way they actually countered it. We had a president that started in 1990. And he was a very populist president, and he came into power without people really understanding how he came into power. But then he actually was the one that was able to do away with terrorism, right? And so from having lived in
I just want to know, how was he able to do that?
How was he able to do what?
To do away with terrorism, like through the iron fist or through policy, carrot and stick, or
no, it was through an iron fist. And that's what it was. Is he ended up becoming a dictator, right? He actually changed the country's constitution so that he could run for a second term because we only had one term for presidents. And so he changed the constitution, ran for a second term, and when his term was up, he said, well, this is technically my first term under the new constitution, and ran again.
Come on, dude.
Right? So he ran again and won.
Yeah, of
right?
course
So
he
he
did.
actually won 3 times. The third time, though, thankfully, he was ousted about a year in, and he ended up fleeing the country and resigning via fax from Japan. All right, his name is Alberto Fujimori. He is actually in jail. He is one of, and to get into current...
Fujimori was the daughter of, he had a daughter that ran against Castillo, who just also was deposed as well.
Yeah, she's run for president like 3 or 4 times and lost every time because nobody likes her. Because honestly, the legacy that Fujimori left behind is, even though it flipped the country into a lot of growth, economic growth, and the middle class did grow, there was a lot of pain behind everything that happened, right? 60,000 people died, and it wasn't at the hands of the terrorists. A lot of it was at the hands of the military. So back to the museum.
Circle back, yeah,
right,
sorry.
Back to the museum, that's actually what the story tells, right? And it was, to speak about the funding was actually from the German government, and it was they have funds for these types of things, having lived through the Holocaust, apparently.
Yeah.
So they fund these types of museums, and the memory museums. In Chile, there's one as well. And anyway, they actually gave the money to the UN to manage because they didn't trust the Peruvian government to manage it properly.
Well, that makes sense.
Right, and so everything that's in that museum, I produced. Everything that's in there, I mean, and every video that's in there, I produced.
Wow.
I'm not saying I made it, but like there was, I was involved in the process.
You were part of it, yeah.
Every piece that's there, I was involved in the process as well, reaching out to the artists and making sure that they got their payments and that they got the pieces in, and that it was all put together. And so when I was doing all that work and interviewing a lot of people, I actually realized there's a concept called displacement, right? So when you're in these situations of war, for example, people are displaced. People are displaced by the armies coming in. People are displaced by, like right now, right? People are being displaced by the Russian army coming into Ukraine or whatever. So this forces people to move. So a lot of the people in Peru moved from the Amazon jungle.
In a sociology class, you would call that push factors, or history class, you would call those push factors.
Okay, well, displacement is what they categorize it down there as. So people have been displaced from the Amazon and the Andes to the coast.
Yeah.
Right? And so I believe, and don't quote me on the numbers, but I believe it's something like only about 30% of the people that were displaced during this time period actually ever went back to their home area, right?
Because they made new homes.
Because they made new homes, because they no longer had anything to go back to, because either all of their family members had been killed, or their homes had been destroyed, or they literally had nothing to go back to, so they just stayed where they were and created,
they got a job, they got a home, they literally just set up shop in a new place.
Yeah. And so when I was doing this work, that's when I realized the severity of, hey, a bomb blew up next to my house. It's the same thing. I had a different opportunity.
Yeah.
And, was able to. But in the end, I was displaced from Peru and ended up moving to the States, right? So it wasn't. That's the reason why I migrated. That's the reason why we migrated as kids, right? Or my parents, brought us over here. So that, to the point, that's things like that are why people migrate. Now, coming back as a U.S. citizen with my wife, with my 2 kids, the experience is completely different.
Can we talk about that in just a moment? I have a little bit of, just want to talk about La Rola Nola. So tune in Saturdays 4 to 6 today. Mid-City Martha, the host of La Rola Nola. La Rola Nola highlights New Orleans and Latin music using the intersectionality of music, activism, and commentary for immigrant justice. La Rola Nola, Saturdays at 4 p.m. exclusively on 102.3 FM and streaming worldwide at whivfm.org/listen. So you were just about to talk about your experience, especially with your family. Go right ahead.
Yeah, so I guess we can backtrack a little, right, and talk about what's been happening. We can get a little bit into Peruvian politics, right? But the last 5 years or 6, I think it's the last 6 years, we've had 7 presidents in Peru, right? And the reason is
that's too many presidents.
Yeah, it's insane. But the reason is there's a lot of corruption, right? The government's a mess. Congress is a mess, and so you have this situation that hasn't, in theory, affected the economy as much. They're still counting growth in their numbers, but there's a lot of political turmoil, right? And honestly, when you're talking about the economy, you're talking about macroeconomics. You're not talking about day-to-day life for working people.
No, you're talking about gross domestic product and maintaining stability. To do that essentially the way that stability is maintained is often enough through violence.
Right. So what's happened is you have a corrupt government, a corrupt Congress that has actually been led mostly by no other than Keiko Fujimori, who is Alberto Fujimori's daughter. And so she's run for president 3 times and lost, but she won Congress. So as the leader of her party, she dedicated the last 10 years of her life basically to, make sure that nobody could govern. And so...
And she's done a good job of that.
She's done a hell of a good job. Right? Seven and of those 7 presidents, I believe 6 of them are in jail. Like, this is just crazy, right? So
she's still got clout. Significant clout.
Yes, exactly. But she can't win the popular vote because there's such a negative sentiment against her, right? Like, let's not talk about local politics and who I would think of. but yes. So there's this situation that happens, and even though macroeconomically the country's still progressing, working people are feeling that, right? Are feeling that burden. So I was an independent filmmaker, basically documentary filmmaker, and worked with a lot of different NGOs all over Latin America for years. And that work dries up very easily because NGOs get defunded basically when situations like that happen, right? We saw it here, through the Trump administration. A lot of NGOs were defunded, right? Lost their funds. So same type of thing happened. And my wife was also a TV producer. And, she would make commercials, and that's really where she would make more money than TV itself. And that also dried up, right? And if we look at the people that are around us, and I'm not talking about, we are mid to upper middle class in Peru, right? Like, we're okay. We can get by.
Yeah. You're not exactly like hoping that your next meal is just gonna like miraculously appear, right?
Exactly. So, but that's not the bulk of people in Peru, right?
Correct.
That's not the bulk of the population. So we started feeling the economic downturn, and we started feeling that pressure. And I mean, in my head, I always knew that we would come back to the States, or I would come back to the States with my son, who was actually born in Miami, and bring my wife and my daughter with us. But the when was kind of up in the air, right?
Sure.
And so that put pressure on us to say, hey, let's jump ahead with this. Let's move our plans up. We moved our plans up almost 4 or 5 years, just because things weren't going as smoothly as they should have. Had we stayed behind, the pandemic would have hit us over there. Peru we're on total lockdown for almost 8 months.
Yeah, people complain here about lockdown because they like closed schools for a couple of months or whatever, and like that is like literally essentially martial law in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it was 8 months where people only one person from your household could actually leave the house for essential things like going to the supermarket or specific things or the pharmacy or whatever. But my son, for example, who was down there with his mom, basically didn't leave his room for 8 months. When I was able to finally bring him up here, we would walk a block and his legs would hurt.
Yeah,
right.
Because he's not used to walking. Literally,
right. Literally, he was like sitting in his chair, like playing video games for 8 months, basically, or doing online classes or whatever.
Yeah.
But in the end, he was stuck in his house without being able to leave for 8 months.
At a critical point of development in his life as well. Like, I mean, not to be like to moralize around it. It's just different than what you experienced or what I experienced. Not even a sign of value to it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And so you have this situation where had we stayed behind, honestly, even being mid to upper middle class, I don't think we would have made it. Honestly, like I don't know how we would have gotten by those 8 months, because I could have done maybe a month or two, but 8 months,
Yeah, that's a long time.
And coming back to it again, any advertising, any commercial work, any NGOs, like all of that was done. There was no work. So all of the people that I worked with, were suffering and are still suffering the consequences of that, right? And so we decided to migrate again, and that experience, you would think as a U.S. citizen, wouldn't be so difficult.
Right. And plus you have something to compare it to as well, which is also interesting.
Right. And so you would think it wouldn't be so difficult. However, it costs us thousands of dollars for me to be able to get my wife and my daughter, the residency. Right?
Yeah. And even like things that you wouldn't even think would cost like lots of money as well, right?
I mean, making photocopies. I spent I think $200 on photocopies.
Wow. Like
it's insane. But that's what you need to present. You need to present all this documentation. You need to gather all this documentation. And we did it on our own, mind you. I didn't hire a lawyer. Like I have an aunt that's a paralegal, and so she reviewed the stuff.
Yeah.
But I didn't have to hire a lawyer. Had I had to hire a lawyer,
thousands more.
It probably would have been $15,000. Who the hell has $15,000 to, go through a normal immigration process? And if you're talking about people from Central America or Venezuela, like that are coming through the border, or Cuba,
And in this country, people like to say, well, why aren't they immigrating to this country in the quote unquote like correct way or the right way or the legal way? Well, I mean, less quotes on the legal part, but the reason is because it's one, onerous in terms of just all the stuff you have to do, and two, onerous from the perspective of it costs a lot of money, and also three, if you're fleeing political instability where, I mean, you have bombs going off at your, right next door to your house or something, you're getting out of there, you ain't waiting around for that.
Yeah. I mean, and if you want to talk about Venezuela, like the Venezuelan government, you can't even get a passport easily.
To go out or go,
like if you don't have a passport, getting a passport from Venezuela is a huge undertaking, right? It can take years. Or whatever, maybe you have to pay someone off. Or I'm sure there's ways around.
There's always that.
But I know people from Venezuela that can't get a passport, or are in the States now and they have to renew their passport, and that is like a huge feat, right? So yeah, if you talk about the ways these immigration policies actually affect people in order to be accessible, I mean, how do we make them accessible? Because they need to be more accessible. Because you can't expect, again, as a U.S. citizen, I came back and I did the paperwork myself, right? And it still cost me thousands of dollars. And that was very difficult. Like, when I came back, I didn't have work. My wife couldn't work because, hey, she doesn't have papers, right? So I came back. We rented a little, 2-bedroom in close to downtown Miami, which was where we found something affordable, and it was also somewhere where you could actually walk in Miami, because that's almost impossible in Miami, if you know Miami.
Not a walking city, yeah.
Not a walking city. You need a car. So I knew we were only going to have one car, So I needed somewhere where I knew my wife could actually walk to the store if she needed to, where my daughter could actually take the bus to go to school if she needed to. So those are things you have to keep in mind. And not everybody has the capacity or the ability to do things like that, right? And even still, that wasn't easy, right? When I initially came back, I started reaching out to a lot of people that I knew that were either had worked at NGOs or had worked at TV, and I started doing Uber and Lyft in the morning. So I would get up at 5 in the morning, 4 in the morning, leave my house between 5 and 6. Right. Thankfully, we lived in a centric area where there were some hotels around. So immediately I would just turn on the thing and the app at my house, and I'd get a.
This was during COVID?
No, this was pre-COVID.
Okay.
This was early 2019 to.
So right before.
Yeah. So it was 2019. And I mean, I did it for about 3 or 4 months.
And that's hard work too, by the way. Not to cut you off. I just want to really dilate on that, because I can't help myself. I talk to everybody. I talk to my drivers when I take cars all the time. I mean, and they just talk about how they work 12-hour days, and they're lucky to make their car payments sometimes. Yeah. No, it is. It's a lot of work, and they have standards by which they have to have nice cars. There's a whole sidebar conversation, but it's not an easy job, is my point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, recently, I said something about the gig economy, and the gig. I growing up, to me, it was you'd get a gig, right? And it was you'd get, and I grew up in film,
Sure.
and that's how a lot of these things are. You're a freelancer, right?
Yeah.
And it was something where, you could get by, and you could work. You wouldn't work every day, but the work that you picked up would be enough to get you by. Now,
because they paid.
Right now, it's become this gig economy is this thing that's just it's minute by minute. You're making you're just racking up penny by penny, and barely getting by half the time. So, but that's what I was doing. I was driving from 5 or 6 in the morning till about 10 or 11 a.m. where I could actually schedule an appointment with someone to have a coffee and sit down and be like, hey, what can I do? Where can I find work? And that's how I started. I needed to make at least $80, $90 a day to be able to pay rent at the end of the month, and not eat up the little savings I had. So, so that wasn't easy either, and picking up little gigs here and there wherever I could. But that wasn't easy. And again, it's one income for a 4-person household, in Miami, which has now gotten ridiculously expensive. Back then it wasn't cheap. People always think that, Florida's cheap. Yeah, maybe some of Florida, but Miami has never been cheap.
Miami's a real city. Miami is a big city.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I don't know, just the way that, I don't know, I hear people, especially in New York, and in this city we have a lot of just high cost of housing and things like that, in terms of it's just a phenomenon that's everywhere, I guess is my point. That is a broadly known and broadly felt phenomenon. The cost of housing just going up.
Yeah, I mean, my neighbor behind me just moved. He was paying, I think, something like $1,200 a month for a 1-bedroom, up until they just raised his rent to about $2,500. So they nearly doubled his rent, or doubled his rent.
Yikes!
It's insane. You can't do that.
Yeah.
But that's just the housing market right now.
Right.
Which is terrible. I don't know where I was going with this anymore.
So real quick, just I have a little PSA about emergency plans here. Experts agree that having an emergency plan and an emergency kit are the best ways to be prepared for severe weather. Preparing an emergency plan for your family is not complicated. If your family is prepared when disaster strikes, having a plan in advance will help you know how to contact one another and get back together after the storm passes. Emergency supplies and first aid kit are easy to assemble and smart ways you can prepare for severe weather. Another community service reminder from your friends at 102.3 WHIV FM. So you were talking about your time as a essentially a Uber Lyft driver, and then and also trying to find whatever work that you could. Where did you go from there?
So, I mean, what ended up happening was I picked up a gig at Nickelodeon. A friend of mine called me. He was head of post-production for a Latin American TV show called Club 57. And he called me one day and he said, hey, I know this is like way beneath your pay grade, but do you want to be an assistant editor? And I said, how much does it pay? And he gave me the price. And I was like, what's the yeah, that sounds great. I mean, it was first off, it was a 3-month gig, so that helped me, kind of level out a bit. But it also was very stress-free. Coming in as an editor or head of post-production, which I've done before, you have all this weight on your shoulders. As an assistant editor, it was just like, what do you guys need? What can I help with?
Yeah.
Kind of thing, and just like making sure that everything's just lining up properly.
Smoothly.
It's just, that's basically it. So it was actually exciting to be able.
Because there's a problem,
relax.
you can go fix it.
it was very easy. Thank you, Oscar, for that. But
Shout out to Oscar.
Shout out to Oscar. Once that was done, again, I went back to, hey, what do I do? So I started doing the same thing, and started driving. And whereas my previous experience had been that I would make about clean, after tolls and gas and everything, about $15 to $18 an hour. I came back and I was barely making 12, barely making 10. And so, and I don't know if it was a seasonal thing or if it was because I had dropped off for 3 months or,
or if they had changed, or if these gig operators had changed the algorithm by which the amount of money you make is less.
Exactly. And to the point you made earlier, I speak to whenever I get an Uber and I get in an office.
I can't help myself. I see somebody in a car, I'm feeling okay. I'll talk to them,
Yeah. I have the same thing. So I start talking to them and I ask them, oftentimes I ask them how much they're making. Oftentimes I ask them what kind of issues they're having. We start talking about these things. And some of them have learned how to actually work within the system. And I think that's great. So they're actually making more money than others. But not everybody has these things, or not everybody has the ability to say, hey, how does actually think that way? Yeah. And so they just take every ride and some of them are barely making the 15. Some of them are barely making 12. Some of them tell me they're making 20, 30. But oftentimes what I find is that they say, yeah, I aim at a certain, a set goal a day. So it's like, I want to make $200 a day at least.
Yeah.
But they'll work 12 to 16 hours.
Yeah.
Driving in Miami.
The cost of gas to what it is. And you mentioned tolls and all this other stuff.
And traffic in Miami is insane, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely not an easy job to that point, to the point you made. It's not an easy job. It's very stressful and it's very strenuous on it's physically, people might think, driving isn't, it's physically straining.
It's work.
It is. It is tough. You're tense all the time. You're aware of you have to be extremely aware of your surroundings. And you're responsible for people.
Yeah.
Right? So, I don't know.
You need to be safe. You need to be paying attention. It's mental work as much as it is physical work. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then I actually did a little lobby day visit to Tallahassee with an NGO called Unidos US. They do great work all over the States, and they have a lot of affiliates. And basically, they do a lot of stuff related to either education or immigration. I worked on this thing. They were trying to pass some education-related laws in Tallahassee for the state of Florida. And so protections for students. And so we went up to Tallahassee, shot this thing, and when they were going to show it, I asked them to please let me know where they would show it, because to me, I know they had 17 affiliates in Florida, right? And to me, I was like, okay, that's 17 prospective clients. So I want to be there when it shows to be able to talk to them and see if something comes out of that, right? And so I did. I went. It played well. People loved it. Spoke to a couple people. Had some good contacts. Had some good leads. And I met this woman who is just wonderful. And we hit it off. And so we started talking. It turns out that she was actually, her parents were from Peru as well. So she was, there was this
something to talk about.
Connection. And her name is Shayla. And so Shayla and I hit it off, and she said, hey, I'm going to put you in touch with my comms person, because I think you guys should get together. Maybe we can work on something together. And to me, I was like, okay, great. This is a good lead for a gig, right? 3 months later, I get an email and from this comms person back saying, hey, Are you? Do you have 5 minutes to talk? Basically, I was, basically doing nothing at home, and I said, "Oh, give me 30 minutes."
Yeah,
just because I didn't want to feel like didn't want anybody to know that I was doing nothing at home.
Yeah, and, just to kind of like give the image of like, let me just
let me put that what I'm doing.
Yeah. And let me wrap this very important thing that I'm doing up and stop playing that video game or whatever.
So anyway, so I get on this call, and basically I was offered a job in at this labor union, right? And I knew nothing about labor. I knew nothing about the labor movement. I knew my birthday is actually tomorrow. It's MLK Day. So
happy birthday.
Thank you. So I knew about MLK. I knew about his connection to labor to some degree. But there were very, very few things that I knew about the labor movement, because honestly, the labor movement is not taught in our classrooms across the United States.
In America or in most countries either.
Yeah. And that's it's definitely done intentionally. It's a way to, kill worker power. But
impossible to do.
Yeah. But that's what they're trying to do.
They're trying, yeah.
So there's a reason why we don't get those lessons in the classroom. And so we so I was asked to come on board and actually work in-house. And to me, that was a difficult decision, because I had been independent since 2007. So it had been already like 12 years that, in Peru, there was a point in time where I employed 10 people, so it was a strange shift in my head. Not to pick up like a 3-month gig at Nickelodeon, which I knew was just like a 3-month gig and that was it. But to actually take on a full-time job. But spoke to my wife about it, and it felt like the right thing to do, because it would give us stability. And in my head, initially, obviously, I said, I'll do it for 6 months, see what happens. If I like it, cool. And if I don't, there goes that, right?
Yeah.
Great benefits. As it stood, my wife and daughter had just gotten their paperwork. They had just gotten their residency and their Social Security, and so I could finally apply for health insurance for them, because before that I couldn't even get health insurance for them because they didn't have a Social Security number.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was like, okay, great. So, but now,
and how do you go see a doctor? How do you? It's so expensive.
It's crazy.
How do you get any kind of medical emergency taken care of?
Right.
You're not a millionaire.
Yeah. Right.
Most people aren't.
Right. So with this job came these benefits and came health insurance for my family. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that to me was like, okay, this is interesting. Let's see what happens with this. And so I started working for this union, and honestly, if I can sum it up, I've been there for 3 years now. If I can, so 6 months are long gone. But if I can sum it up, honestly, the reason I stayed and the reason why I'm here and the reason why I think the labor movement is probably the most, if not the most, one of the most important pillars of our society, is that it is the way that we can actually push all of us forward, society as a whole forward, right? And I saw that in that my work, my like putting out a tweet, creating a video, shooting pictures of actions of workers taking action, I've seen how that has had a direct effect on working people from immediately, from one day to the next. And even there was a point in time where workers were actually walking back after a 3-day strike in Miami, and they were told that they couldn't go back to work, right? Which is clearly illegal, right?
What kind of workers was this?
Janitorial workers.
Okay.
And so when we, put the machinery to work, basically 45 minutes later, they got a text saying, oops, sorry. I didn't mean that, right? And so not only did they get their jobs back, they technically never really lost them.
Right.
But they also got pay raises. There were people that didn't have access to parking, and they ended up getting access to parking. Their workloads were reduced, and this was immediate, right? It was immediate because of their action. They took they went on a 3-day strike. That's not easy. It's not easy for anyone, right? But the fact that we could actually help support them, because that's our job, right? As part of labor union staffers, our job is solely to support the workers.
Yeah.
Like our job is just to make sure that they have what they need when they need it, and that they get the best outcome from whatever it is action that they decide to take. And so that's amazing. Like I've worked in education and with NGOs since 2007, right? I actually started working with NGOs in 2007 with MTV. we created a docuseries called Agents of Change, where we would highlight Agentes de Cambio for the Latin American market. We would highlight young people doing important stuff all over Latin America to change their environment. So I've worked with people that do all sorts of things all over Latin America. But most of these projects are long-term projects, right? And so, like, if you're working in education, I mean, you got to wait 30 years to see if the kid doesn't, turn out like it doesn't.
And honestly, like, if you've taught for any amount of time, I mean, I've had kids, like, literally, you'll just hear horror stories. Like, I had some kid that you taught 10 years ago committed suicide or something like that, or there, and you only hear about the ones that have had bad experiences, unfortunately, more than you would be the ones that have, like, they go and just live a normal life. You hear about the worst situations too.
There's that brings something to mind, but not going to get into that right now. That was a tough thing to swallow, but if you work on these projects, they're also long-term, and you don't really see the immediate impact on people. And that's just...
Sometimes you do. Sometimes you'll see, like you just mentioned, boom, 15 minutes, and, the workers are,
But that happens in the labor movement.
Yeah.
You don't see that in education.
In real life, yeah.
You don't see
or
that.
Not real life, it is real life. But you know what I mean, in other situations, in other dynamics, in other settings.
Yeah. So to me, that's what's thrilling to me, and that's what's kept me here, and I think that's the fuel to my fire. Honestly, it's seeing the change. I mean,
it's very powerful. like literally,
it's amazing, and you build these beautiful relationships, and you hear as a documentarian, it's like I'm all about listening to people's stories. Like, I love listening to people's stories. I love learning about people and meeting them and seeing who they are, and being able to come into their homes and having them tell me about their families and you build these relationships. Like, we have 175,000 members up and down the East Coast. Like, that's a lot of people, right? And day to day, we are working to impact their lives positively. And it's just, I get text messages, like good morning text messages from members, and like memes that they send me on my phone. And it's beautiful. And obviously, you reply back and you say hi and you talk every once in a while. But it's because you've become a part of their life. You've become a part of their family. And that's, like, I feel like I have 175,000 family members now, in the States. And that's beautiful. I had never felt that before. And I think that's the power behind the labor movement is everybody feeling that sense of family and unity, honestly. I mean, union, right? But how do we make it so that more people now understand that, and so that more people understand the power of that, and so that more people actually join, right? Because labor unions are what? 6%, 9%, 7%?
10%, like around like 9-10% in America. Public sector is around like 30% unionization. Private sector is like 6% or 7%. Something very, very like horribly low.
Right, exactly. Which is
it's a result of policy in the United States, no question, and just complete, I mean, culture of America, and like a lot of these, BS like lines that we get fed even in school. I mean, one of the funny things, just to kind of like not get too sidetracked here, but one of the funniest things that I thought was just completely, just like, I am completely black-pilled on the education system, is when I started teaching like middle school, I discovered that there is an entire unit in the Louisiana curriculum, and I believe it's copied in other states, just dedicated to Steve Jobs. It is literally the central theme of the unit is Steve Jobs. And one of the central texts is some speech that he gave to some college, before he died or whatever. It's so outrageous to me. Just that, like, I can't think of any better example of like canonizing someone in an official way, in such a propagandistic way. I mean, you're teaching this to sixth graders. You're basically telling them that they can all be a Steve Jobs or whatever, without any of the context.
Right. That's wild.
Yeah.
That's just wild.
And that builds anti-solidarity in a lot of ways too. That's the point.
Right. Exactly.
Because if you're Steve Jobs, you could be a zillionaire.
But I remember growing up, like I always had like an entrepreneurial spirit, right? And now, like, looking back on the last 40 years of my life, it's like, where the hell did that come from? Now, my dad has always been somewhat independent, and so I always attributed it to that. But I think there is some element of, okay, was I kind of fed like this is the way because it is a way to divide us and it is a way to split us up, right? Like we can't all be entrepreneurs. Yes, some of us will be, and some of us will create great things, but not everybody will, and not everybody can.
And you don't have to.
And that's okay. That's okay. It doesn't have to happen, right? Like you can maybe accomplish a lot more if you actually created a co-op.
In fact,
right?
None of these people could create the great things that they themselves did as individual actors without workers doing it. Yeah. It's not possible to have Steve Jobs without having the millions of Apple employees and also workers in essentially like sweatshops that build PCB boards, motherboards, and all these components that go into the computers. Like it's like the idea that the individual is able to make this possible, like alone by themselves, is like it fits perfectly in terms of like the American narrative, and it's something that goes beyond before America, but it's something that really America grabbed onto. But like, and it's. I don't know. It's just it's one of those like fables, one of those fairy tales that like that really messes with people's brains. You know what I mean? Like that could be me.
Yeah. I remember this brought it to mind. There's this Radiohead video of like, it's a split screen video. I don't know if you've seen it or you remember that, but there's like, I think it's like a kid in the States, like going through their day, and a kid in somewhere in, I think it's Asia, going through their day, like working at a factory and blah, blah, blah. Uh-huh. And it's just like this juxtaposition of these two images. And to the point, it's like, it's the Apple workers. It's also the factory workers over.
Oh yeah. I was just one example. Yeah.
Right. But it's kind of, it's pretty wild. There's, I think there's also something to be said. And I think this is a point that we should talk about is, yes, there are, 30, 40 years of anti-labor policy in this country, right?
Oh, yeah. Since Adolf Reed puts it the best, actually. He said that the reason that they have social democracy and strong unionization in Europe and not here is because after the war, after World War II, Europe was largely destroyed. And in America, we got rich off of it. Capital was fat and happy and just like looking to essentially just like hunt. And it was a successful generations long project to just destroy the working class and the middle class.
Right. And so there's also something to be said about that has a place. I'm no labor historian, clearly. Sure. I mean, I started learning about labor and labor history 3 years ago when I started at this job. Like, that's my reality, right? And I've learned a lot, thankfully, and I've read a lot, and I'm really happy to see these things and to learn about this history. But there's also something I think really important, or a really important point to talk about how split people are on this subject even alone, right? I mean, the fact that you have more progressive or lefty organizations calling, big unions, or calling, quote, big labor.
Big labor.
Like the
one of my favorite terms.
The enemy of the working class.
Or the enemy of progress, yeah.
And it's just, it's
I remember that one specifically when it came to like the Sanders election, when it was the culinary union in Nevada, when they made the, in my opinion, very bad decision, though I can see how they came to the conclusion, to like soft support Biden. And part of that was because they negotiated a hell of a healthcare deal with the casinos out there, and Medicare for all is something that could provide some kind of instability to that. Now, in my view, that would actually make it so that there would be better negotiation for they've been in a position to negotiate for other things, but obviously the leadership of that union didn't see it that way. But like, they made, in my opinion, an awful decision. And then you see people on Twitter saying that Culinary 226 is enemies of the working class or whatever, the leaders of it or whatever. And it's just like, I don't know, man. Maybe they're just doing a bad job on this particular thing. Yeah,
I mean, there's specific issues that you actually face, right? And it's I think it's there's so much on the table. Right? There really is. There's so much on the table. And I think that what I personally like about the work that we do is that we really try to look at the individual as a whole. And that means not only looking at what's in their contract, or what's better for them specifically, but what's better for their families, what's better for their communities, and how we can actually help shape all that and push that forward. And I think that's super powerful, right? Because you're not just talking about the one specific contract. Now, on the contract, you're obviously, I'm not involved in that,
Of course.
thankfully. At least not now. But I have seen negotiations, and I have been at the bargaining table with members, and it's just it's a beautiful thing to see the members take ownership of what their contract actually looks like, and be the decision makers at the table. Like that's, and I know that maybe isn't how it happens across the board, but to the point I was trying to make before, it's like, just because it doesn't happen across the board doesn't mean that that's what should be happening, and that there aren't, people that are actually in unions that are actually doing that. I mean, yes, democracy is the backbone of what unions should be. The workers need to have a say in what happens in their union. And the only way that happens is if the workers are actually involved.
Yeah.
And I think that...
You can't make them get involved.
No, but they have to be involved. And so I love seeing a bargaining table with, 20 members sitting there with some of union leadership or local leadership, and seeing them actually make the agenda and say what's important to them and say what they can and can't bring back to their coworkers.
And sitting across the table from their boss and being, at least for a minute, equal.
Yeah, it's wild. I mean, in meeting some of our members, I've had these conversations and I've asked them what that feels like, and it's just like, it's
nothing like it.
Yeah, it's just they feel like finally they can actually get something done, right? And that that their bosses at that point are even afraid of what they can actually accomplish, right? And I think that's powerful, because that's taking your power back, right? That's literally taking your power back, and I think that's just such a, I don't know, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful sentiment.
Yeah, 100%. And just sort of like to wrap us up, we have about 5 minutes left. Just sort of like your, I guess, final thoughts in terms of, what are some, you posed a question earlier of like, what are some of the things that we can do kind of looking forward, as people who are either affiliated with unions, who work with unions, or who are just supporters, or even groups like DSA or whatever. Like, what can these sort of like supposedly aligned, groups and types of people do to advance workers and support one another? It's a tough question.
Yeah, well, I'm not. I mean, no, DSA.
You can leave them out of it. You can leave them out of it.
No, just because. But I think DSA is a good example of, from what I know, from what I understand, because I've not been involved in DSA.
Sure.
But from what I understand, even within DSA, there's a struggle of like, who's pushing further left and who's not, and like there's all this back and forth. And I think that's what happens across the. It's like a good example of what happens across the board.
Too much internal, like,
right. It's like, why the hell aren't we all working together? In the end, we're like, yes, maybe you want to push further. Great. Okay, we know that our capacity is to push this far. All right. So is that really going to stop you from keeping pushing? No, you keep pushing forward.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But unless we all start working together, we're gonna just keep moving back.
Yeah, you have to engage.
Because in the end, we're fighting against each other. To ideally, or in the long run, do the same thing, right? Is raise people out of poverty. Like, that's the end goal, is raise people out of poverty, right? Is to some degree redistribute the wealth that has been accumulated by such a small number of people in this country now, right? And that control so much. And it's not, you don't have to hate the billionaires, but you also don't have to aspire to be a billionaire, because that's not your reality. You might never get there. Your reality is today. And unless you come together with somebody else that's also dealing with your reality and help push that forward, then sorry, you're never going to get to be a billionaire. Like, it's just not going to happen, because the billionaires are just going to keep growing. Yeah. Their wealth, So I think that's the goal. The idea is, unless we all work together, and I mean, I think there's also a point to be said about organizations that aren't in these spaces, right? And there's a conversation we have to have about, last year's labor notes, and I definitely think that should happen.
we definitely need to circle back to that.
Yeah. But
we need to get Joan on.
Yeah, we need to get Joan on, and I think that would be a great discussion, because I think that's that's where this conversation needs to happen, because I think it's an understanding that we can't be hating on each other. We can't be putting each other down in order, because
you can be critical
in order to move forward. Yes, by all means, be critical. When somebody screws up, call them out on it.
Yeah,
absolutely, right? Absolutely, call them out on it. But in the end, if your goal is to get from point A to point B, and my goal is also to get to point B eventually, I just know that there might be more steps in my trajectory. There might be more steps to get to point B. You want to push it all the way, keep pushing it all the way. But work with me. Work with what we know we can attain. And unless we are in those spaces as well, we just have to learn to work together. I think that's really our biggest obstacle. Honestly, is
we're getting in each other's way.
yeah.
In
that's
some
what
situations
happens,
too.
right?
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Raul. And we could have. I mean, this discussion could continue in so many different directions. Like, I start to think about where. Like how unions have historically engaged with elected officials and things like that. That's a whole discussion that we could potentially have in the future. But thank you so much for joining us on Good Morning Comrade. Anything you want to say before we go? Is there any way we can follow you maybe on Twitter? Yeah, it's RAZUMARX, Raul Marx, on Twitter, Instagram, everywhere. RaulMarx.com is also, I think you could see some video work there. Cool. Thank you for having me, man. Of course, man. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, and next time, anytime we can make this happen. So, thank you for listening to Good Morning Comrade, everybody. And we love you. Goodbye.